Hello, welcome to your Urban Connection. This is a channel that is often imitated but is never duplicated. And as usual, remember to hit that subscribe button. And if you have any comments regarding this program, just feel free to leave your comments. Now, today we're going to do a show that is meant to inform you as to what is happening around the country as it relates to uh, people of color. And today is going to be, I think you're going to learn a lot about what's going on in the healthcare field today, because we have something, an interesting bombshell announcement that was just announced here just within the last week or so. So with me today is my special guest, Dr. Kichi Anderson. She is the Director of Nursing at Central Michigan University School of Medicine. Welcome and thank you so very much for coming, Dr. Anderson.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Okay, Doctor, what I'd like to do to start here is I'd like for you to tell my audience exactly a little bit about your background, how long you've been in nursing, what you do, and just bring us up to date.
Okay, well, my name is Kechi Hedru Anderson, and I am, as James stated, I am a faculty member, I am a professor and the nursing program director at Central Michigan University. In this interview, I am not speaking on behalf of my institution. This is just, a discussion between me and James here. So I am the program director here. I have been a nurse for over 25 years. Most of that time is in the United States. And I have been in academia now for full-time for 10 years. I have, worked with pre-licensure nursing students, and now I work with RN to BSN completion students. And my research focus over the past few years has been on investigating racism, the experiences of racism with Black nurses predominantly. I work predominantly with Black nurses. For their experiences of racism, I look at it from their experience in the healthcare setting as providers, as nurses who are in practice. I look at their experiences with advancement in nursing, into nursing leadership, into faculty positions, as well as opportunity to advance their career. And through those processes, we have learned a lot about those experiences, that it doesn't end while they are nursing students or end when they begin practice, but it actually continues for many as they continue to advance their career into faculty positions and also into leadership positions. However, there are things, I think in the current climate, nurses of color are speaking up more about those experiences and, finding solutions or ways to address them. So that's what I do, is teach nursing students as well as, do research in areas, about racism, finding solutions on how we can address racism, and that's my goal.
Okay, and I appreciate that. And let me just say, ma'am, that, of course, the reason that I have you as my guest today is certainly in keeping with your research. And I'm going to ask you a question. In your research, and you say you've been doing research for how long on the racism in nursing?
On racism now for about 4 years.
Okay, fine.
More than that.
So let me ask you, and I'm sure you do this across the country, right?
Yes.
Okay, and what has your research, what have you found in your researches in terms of racism in the nursing field?
So what I have found is it is not worse or better in one place across this country, that nurses across this country, nurses of color, Black nurses across this country experience racism equally. It doesn't matter where they are. The only difference perhaps is if they went to predominantly, white institutions, or if they went to institutions that have more diversity, their experiences might be slightly different. So really, it doesn't matter in what area of the country they are, that they went to school or where they work. There is an experience of racism no matter where they are. So, when one of the questions that I get sometimes after, I have presented my research is, oh, well, what area of the country did you get your people? And the good thing about my study is I recruit from across the country. So I do not limit my participants from one part of this country, because that gives a perspective that the problem of racism in nursing education, and nursing practice is not limited to one region of our country. It is an endemic problem within our society. It permeates every aspect of nursing, including education and practice. So nurses experience those issues. And what happens though is, as they go through as students, many of the Black nurses have found ways to continue to transcend those experiences, right? They have found ways to work around it or to go through it and continue to thrive. But for many others, it comes at a cost. Those experiences of racism comes at very great cost. Sometimes people experience physical symptoms from those experiences of racism. Sometimes it's psychological symptoms, sometimes it's just outright stress and burnout. People leave professions, people leave their jobs in search of another area where they can have better experiences. But the truth that so many people have found out is, it doesn't matter where you go, that you are going to probably go through the same experience. For instance, one of my studies, one of my participants said, well, it took me time, but I finally recognized that I either stay there and fight or leave and start over and continue to experience the same thing. So that tells you that the experience is not just something that goes away because you moved. It might be a little better if the leaders of those institutions are taking steps, to address the problem. However, if it is ignored, like it's often ignored in most places, those problems continue. And another thing is, in nursing profession or even in healthcare in general, sometimes we like to call it different names, right? Rather than saying people are experiencing racism or racial microaggressions or racial microassaults, in their healthcare practices, in their workplaces, we tend to give them names like bullying, right? We tend to give them names like lateral violence. But there's a difference between experiencing lateral violence, which is not easy, right? It's still a problem. However, it is much worse when that lateral violence or bullying is related to who you are, to your identity, to your racial identity, which you cannot do anything about. It's not because of the quality of your work or your level of intelligence, but simply because you look different. So people treat you different, or because people have been meant to believe that because of the color of your skin, because of the historical context of how Black people have been viewed in this country, that you cannot lead effectively because you're a Black person, you're a Black nurse, or that you can't be an effective teacher, because you are a Black nurse. So those issues still plays a role in how Black nurses are viewed within our profession. So that's sort of what I have been finding, and that issues that need to be addressed.
Okay, Dr. Anderson, you've answered my questions. So this discrimination and racism is not limited to any particular region, it's all over America, is that correct?
Yes, it is correct.
Okay, so I'm gonna read to you, ma'am, and you're familiar with this, but for my audience who's not aware of this, I'm gonna read an article that was written last week on August the 16th. And it was an apology from the American Nurses Association. And it's apology to nurses of color. Now, this apology alludes to the systemic and systematic racial discrimination and racism that has been going on for over 50 years in the United States. And I'm going to read to you what they say. The American Nurses Association acknowledged that for 50 years, it purposefully, systemically, and systematically excluded Black nurses, including practices that resulted in Black nurses being denied membership in some state nurses associations and education requirements that disenfranchise nurses of color. Full inclusion of Black nurses within American Nurses Association leadership and decision-making remains unrealized and it's elusive for all nurses of color. The ANA statement read. So that means, Dr. Anderson, that this systemic, systematic racism in the nursing field is going on today as we speak. Am I not correct?
You're correct. So it's ongoing. And I
Yes.
think that's, we would love to think or to say that we are in post-racial America, right? But we know we are not in post-racial America. But I do applaud, the American Nurses Association for acknowledging what has been going on or what goes on, because I think awareness of a problem, right, is perhaps the first step in addressing that problem. If American Nurses Association had continued to deny the existence of racism by failing to acknowledge the harm that has been done for generations, for decades, to nurses of color, then all the work that they want to try to do now to address those issues would really be, I don't know, for lack of a better word, would be pouring water on stone, hoping that it's gonna grow, right? So, yes. But I think that with this initial acknowledgement, what needs to follow are tangible actions to address all of those harms, all of those areas that we as a profession have failed for decades, by denying opportunity, by denying access to nurses of color in this country. So now, with the acknowledgement of this issue, and last year, I don't know if you saw that, there was also the survey of nurses in this country about racism within the profession, which shows that there is racism and that is a major problem within our profession, right? So those are issues that needs to be addressed. So with American Nurses Association coming out and acknowledging this problem that exists, and now going to take action, and that's what we want to wait to see, right? What action will they take? If we were to do this survey again, the survey that was done last year, if we are to do it in 5 years, would it be different? Would we get different result? Or would it be the same result as what we had last year? So the problem of racism still exists in nursing. It is still happening as you and I speak in nursing profession. The experiences of nurses of color is significantly different from the experiences of their white peers, both during their nursing education and during their practice. So those are the issues that as a profession we continue to deal with.
Dr. Anderson, I have to ask you this question.
Yes.
Why has it taken 50 years for this issue to surface?
Well, nursing, there are many reasons, I suppose, because nursing is a caring profession, right? To care is what we are known for. As a profession, we are one of the most trusted professions in the country. And it's really contrary to everything we believe in or the public believe about us, that, we could be perceived as not living up to the ideals of our profession. That is, equity, inclusion, decrease disparity, treating people with dignity and respect, and giving people access and opportunity, and not denying them access and opportunity. And I think that some of the it is very difficult for a profession whose ideals are supposed to reflect, social justice and all of the things associated with social justice, to see themselves or to be portrayed as not living up to those ideals. So I think that's perhaps one of the issues. And also, we live in a country, where people don't want to believe that racism exists, or that there are systems or structures in place that prevent everybody from having equitable access to resources and opportunities. So nothing within this system may have denied or been silent. They have been silent for so long about these experiences, about the experiences of nurses of color. We have been complacent in our actions or inactions related to these issues. But I think what happened in 2020, COVID-19, George Floyd, all of those things are like myriad of effects that finally say enough is enough. People are speaking up. People are more emboldened. Nurses of color are speaking up more, and people are finally listening. There has to be a reckoning to these experiences. The COVID-19 disproportionately affected people of color across this country. We watched George Floyd get murdered in public, right? And before, people wouldn't believe that if there wasn't this, it's like raising a mirror to yourself to see what kind of society we are in, and the kinds of things that we let slide because we are not always looking at it. So we are doing a sort of reflection of our complacency in what has been happening with racism within our profession. So it's time to we're taking a mirror to ourselves as a profession, and then we are, going to take action to address those problems. But I think also that nursing, like I said, there's a reckoning, there's speaking up, but also nurses of color are more courageous. There are more nurses of color in places of influence. Not enough. We are still profoundly underrepresented in leadership, in policy making, and all of those things. We are still profoundly underrepresented, but many of the nurses who find themselves in these positions are speaking up more and addressing the issues a lot more. And finally, perhaps we hope people are beginning to listen. And as a profession, we have to live up to our ideals of being that caring profession, the profession others look up to, so that people within our profession can achieve to their highest potentials without, barriers related to their racial identification within our profession.
Dr. Anderson, you addressed one of my major concerns, and that was, why has not the nurses of color, and I'm going to expand it, not only Black nurses, but Hispanic nurses face the same systematic racism. Asian nurses face the same systematic racism. So why have not these nurses that are affected, why have they refused to shine the light on this problem?
Well, they haven't refused. They haven't refused to shine light on the problem. They have been speaking out. So, but let's talk about structural racism, right? The people who are in positions of power and authority make the decisions, right? So, in the nursing profession, leadership is majority, white nurses, more than 80%. Nurse faculty are white, right? The policy making in the nursing profession are white. when you come to the publication of journals, the publication of research, the publication of articles in nursing profession, it's controlled by white people. So what happens is what gets published, what gets disseminated is controlled by those who are in power, correct? So for sometimes I had a publication 2 years ago talking about a discussion of race and racism in nursing profession. And one of the findings is that nurses do not name racism. We don't name it, we call it something different. So rather than say people are experiencing racism, we find a better, more palatable word to use instead of racism, right? Because racism is an ugly word. So we don't want to use that. We don't want to upset people by using that word. You know, we use words to make people comfortable because we don't want to make them uncomfortable. And sometimes when you publish a paper or when you submit papers to be published, you are forced to change the language in your publication because it doesn't quite sound very comfortable for the people who are reviewing or for the people who are publishing it. So there is silencing of nurses of color across the board because, you know, white nurses control what gets published. So nurses of color have not been silent about their experience. They have just endured and find a way to work around it as they progress. So that's what's happening. So the more we have nurses of color in faculty positions, at the policy-making table, at the decision-making table in leadership positions across this country, the more voice people of color, nurses of color are going to have in the decision-making within our professions. The more nurses of color we have reviewing published journals, published articles, submitted manuscripts to journals, the more we are going to see diverse voices in what gets published and how things are addressed and identified. Because oftentimes, what you find in some nursing journal is that rather than stating that an issue is because of people's experiences of racism, we like to say it's because of a different reason, right? So I think that's what you are saying. We haven't been silent. I definitely haven't been silent about it. So many people have spoken up, many nurses of color speak up. But unfortunately, like I said, when you are not at the table where decisions are made, when you are not at the table where policies are decided, then your voice is diminished. And that's what has been going on.
Dr. Anderson, let me point to one thing. You say that people don't like the term or the word racism. But ma'am, let's call it for what it is. And when we have the facts to back it up, we should not hesitate to call it for what it is. Systemic, institutional racism. Now, let me point something out to you real quickly. In 2020, November of 2020, the American Medical Association, the nation's largest group of doctors, deemed racism, and that's the word they use, racism, a public health threat. This article, ma'am, uses the word racism because that's what it is. We have to not be afraid of offending somebody who does not want to admit that it is racism, but that's what it is, institutional racism. And they go on here to say that it was intentional, okay? It purposefully, that's intentional. Systematically and systemically excluded Black learners. Ma'am, that's pure racism. And I understand some people are going to be offended. Some people don't want to use the word racism. Some people don't want to talk about it. But we have to talk about it. We have to call it for what it is. And we've got to expose it where and when we find it. That's all I'm talking about. Now, let me just say one other thing to you right quick. In this article, in this apology, they acknowledge the fact that an overwhelming majority of nurses of color reported experiencing are witnessing racism, according to a 2021 National Commission to Address Racism in Nursing survey of more than 5,600 nurses. They continue to use the word racism, ma'am. So why should we hesitate to use the word racism? That's what it is.
That is exactly my point. So if you look in the nursing literature, in the past 2 years, 2.5 years perhaps, when you look in nursing literature, you are going to find the word racism more prominent when the issues being addressed is racism. Before the past 3 years, you would find different language instead of the word racism. So that's what I meant, that, when you said earlier, I think one of your questions is, why has nurses of color been silent, right? So
Yes.
and that's what I'm saying, that they haven't been silent, but they have been silenced.
Okay.
They
Okay,
have
so
been
now,
silenced. They haven't been silent.
okay, so let me ask you this question. I don't mean to interrupt you, but one of the nurses who is a registered nurse and the assistant professor at the University of California, UCLA, stated this: for far too long, nurses of color have had to make the choice of speaking up and facing the consequences of speaking up, or staying silent and feel eaten up on the inside. What are the consequences of speaking up, ma'am?
So that's exactly my point, right? So you have to make a choice. And that's why we say you cannot be silent, because if you remain silent, nothing changes. So so look at what has happened with American Nurses Association. They apologized. They acknowledged that there was racism in nursing, correct?
Yes.
This
Word.
apology didn't happen last year. It didn't happen the year before or 2 years ago. And that's the point I am making, is that for so long, nurses of color have endured and they have been silent or silenced, but they refuse to be silent anymore. So now they are empowered and they are speaking up. And we are seeing the actions because of their being bold. Okay, so think about it this way. And if you go back to the American Nurses Association and the history of American Nurses Association as an institution, because that's what they are, an institution, right? So if you look at the leadership of American Nurses Association in the past 50, 60 years, you will count in your one hand the number of Black presidents or CEOs of the organization. But in the past 4 years is Dr. Ernest Grant, another Black nurse leader. And under his leadership, a lot has changed in the organization. And that's what I mean, that when you have nurses of color, when you have Black nurses and other nurses of color in leadership, you see changes, because nurses of color understand the needs of the constituents. They understand the needs of nurses of color within this country. But when you are excluded, when nurses of color are excluded from the decision-making table, things don't usually change, because the interests of nurses of color are not as prominent as it would be if they have representation at the decision-making table. So, and those are the things, again, like I mentioned, so American Nurses Association have, made this apology. The next step in the apology is, what are you going to do about it? We hear you. It is a good start. It's a beginning. What is the next action? And the next action, as far as, from my own perspective, is using their influence to ensure that more nurses of color get into faculty positions, get the scholarships or grants to publish more. They get, financial assistance to complete their education. They get mentoring into these leadership positions. They get mentoring into policy making. All of those things are critical to what can be done to remedy the harm that have been done and ongoing for so long within our profession. So I agree with what you have said. You know, there's no disagreement with what you've said and what you've read to me. So there is racism in nursing at every level within our country. And it needs to stop, it needs to end. But it can only end if there is action behind the words. So the apology is well received. Now, what we need is the action to back up the apology, to back up the words.
And Dr. Anderson, I just want to say this to you. That action that you're talking about has to be from the top of the food chain, from the boardroom down to the hospital rooms, okay? Because that's where most of this discrimination and racism is carried out, is in those hospital rooms. And let me give you one example. One of the nurses of Asian descent, and this was just last week, tell you what she said.
Yep.
She went into a room and encountered a patient who refused to let her or any nurse of color care for her. The patient used racially derogatory terms and wouldn't even let a nurse of color walk into her room. Ma'am, this is way, way, way out of line. And these nurses that experience this type of discrimination, regardless if they're Black, they're Hispanic, they're Asian, indigenous, whatever, this should not be tolerated by any nursing association, any medical facility, any hospital in the country. And that's what I'm saying. And the article says that nurses of color look for action after the official apology from the American Nurses Association. And as you have described, those are just words. If they're not followed up by action, they are meaningless words. So my question to you is, and this will be my final question, ma'am, how long will you all wait to see some action?
So I'm glad that you actually read that scenario from the Asian nurse and experience. And unfortunately, that is nothing new, right? But she has the courage to talk about it. That experience happens every day in this country. And like you said, it's failure of leadership. It is a failure of leadership because such actions, whether it is from a patient or a patient family, must be addressed. Nurses do not have to endure such racial assaults, whether in words or action, where they work. And organizations need to have policies to protect the nurses and physicians too, and nursing assistants who experience it. They need to have some policy and some actions on how to address those things when they happen. The same way patients have rights, nurses should also have rights, right? Words are powerful. So the kinds of words that patient spoke to all those nurses of color that they're refusing care from, it doesn't end when the word that is spoken ends. If it has ended there, this nurse would not be talking about it, right? You will not be reading it to me now. It's right. Because those words are powerful. It harms, it causes harm to the nurses, to the nurses assistant, to the physicians. Anybody who experiences that goes home with that word in those words in their head. You know, you internalize it sometimes, right? Because such words comes from a place of hate for a group of people who are just doing their jobs, yes. Right? So like you said, what action and how long are we gonna wait, right? We have waited over 100 years for this apology, right?
Yes.
But the apology has happened. So we don't want to have to wait another 100 years. We don't have to wait, we don't want to wait, we don't even want to wait another 10 years. We want to see actions now. And some of those actions is American Nurses Association, the largest association of nurses in this country, to work with their practice partners to begin to have policies in place, to work with the accrediting agencies of these hospitals, the Joint Commission. They talk about protecting nurses where they work, creating healthy work environment. But some of those healthy work environments also comes from protecting nurses from verbal racial abuse from patients. So some of those things, they can all do something to make sure that it doesn't happen to nurses by explaining to patients and their relatives that these actions cannot be tolerated from you when you are here receiving care, that the people who provide you care also have rights as humans to be protected from any form of abuse, including racial assault, racial verbal abuse, or any kind of abuse. So that's where it has to begin. So however they are going to work with their major stakeholders in practice, at the boardroom, in the hospital bed, in the classrooms, and institutions of learning, to create policies to address these issues becomes very critical. And I think that is the next step from the American Nurses Association, is to get all these stakeholders together and say, what is the next step? What do we put out there to help organizations institute policies, actionable policies that can protect nurses of color from experiencing this ongoing abuse, so that in 2 years, when we do this review, this survey again about experiences of racism, we get a far better result than the one we got in 2021.
Dr. Anderson, final comments. Nurses of color are underrepresented in the registered nurse workforce. According to a Health Resources and Services Administration survey, about 73% of the nation's registered nurses are white. 8% are Black, 5% are Asian, 10% are Hispanic or Latino, and fewer than 1% are indigenous people. That should be priority number one, to increase the numbers of nurses of color in your profession. Ma'am, I want to say thank you very, very much. I really enjoyed talking with you. I could talk with you for another hour, but in respect for your time, I just want to say, ma'am, you and I need to stay in touch, because I'm sure we should talk again. Thank you so very much for joining me, ma'am. It has been a pleasure.
Absolutely. It's my pleasure speaking with you as well. Have a good evening.
Okay, thank you very much, ma'am.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye.